Excellent. I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, I'm going to record it to my desktop here, so it should be in, I think, MP4 format, which is pretty compatible with just about everything out there.
Very good.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for having us today. My name is Seth Whitehead, and I'm the Executive Director of the Illinois Petroleum Resources Board. We're going to do a Petro Pros presentation for you today. And what that is basically, we've got a couple of oil industry professionals with us today. Mike Payne from Shawnee Oil Company, he's a petroleum engineer, and Ross Basnett from Campbell Energy. He is a petroleum geologist, and they're going to talk about what the skills they employ to find oil in Illinois. And I know this is a math class. Science is the most important subject, I think, for our industry, but math is definitely a close second. So they're especially going to emphasize some of the math skills that they use every day to do their jobs. Real quickly, though, in case you're wondering what IPRB is, the Illinois Petroleum Resources Board is a industry-funded education and outreach program. We talk to schools, we talk to the general public, and just generally speaking, try to educate folks about the oil production industry. And we also do work to restore abandoned oil field sites in the state of Illinois. So just starting off, just to give, and I've put myself in a timer because I want these guys to do most of the talking today, but just to kind of give you an overview of oil use and the industry in Illinois. I think it's real important to understand energy is to understand basic math. It's essential. So just looking at some numbers, and I got numbers all over. I'm a big numbers guy, so hopefully, you know, with the math classes is pretty appropriate. But just looking at our current energy consumption, we get about 70% of our energy in the United States from oil and natural gas. Petroleum is the #1 source of energy at 37%. So that's a huge chunk of the energy mix that you can see on the pie chart here to the left. So what I think a lot of folks are surprised to find out is, you know, when you think of oil, you'll probably think of gasoline, and that's definitely a huge component of what oil is used for. But 55% of oil demand is non-gasoline, and actually just a little less than a third, 31%, is used outside the transportation sector, mainly to make about 6,000 different things that we use every day. So a lot of people think, well, we use a lot of oil now, but we won't need it in the future, that renewable energy is going to take over and replace oil. That's not really what the Department of Energy is projecting. This is the chart to the left here shows, as you can see, the green line, renewables are definitely going to increase big time over the next 30 years or so. But according to the Department of Energy, which is the foremost expert agency in the United States, petroleum is going to remain the top source of energy, even looking out 30 years from now to 2050. So, and there's a reason for that. Overall energy demand throughout the world, and this is hard to wrap my head around, and I wonder where the energy is going to come from. It's going to increase 50%. A lot of people ask, well, how is that possible? Well, the world's adding the population of Birmingham, Alabama every single day. That's 225,000 people. We're going to be at 9 billion people in the world in, I believe, next year. So what we're going to need is a lot more energy. And so with that fact in mind, even with the build out of renewables and other sources, the Department of Energy projects we're going to need 25% more oil, which finding that is going to be tough. And that's what these guys do, Ross and Mike. So right now I'm just play a quick video we put together that shows kind of an overview of all the things oil is used for other than gasoline.
You might have read that we don't need oil anymore, or that the oil industry is in an existential crisis. But in reality, the world is going to need a lot of oil for many decades to come. Here's why. Oil is most commonly associated with gasoline. But did you know that 55% of petroleum demand is non-gasoline? Petrochemicals represent as much as 15% of petroleum demand and are used to make more than 6,000 everyday products, many of which are absolutely essential. Without oil, healthcare workers would be without dozens of tools that save lives. Computers, smartphones, and a myriad of tech gadgets would not exist, and even renewable energy infrastructure could not be manufactured. 20% of petroleum demand is distillate fuel, primarily consumed as diesel fuel. Diesel is used to distribute necessities such as food and medical supplies, and is the dominant fuel used by modern farming equipment to feed the world, and there is no scalable substitute. Roughly 10% of petroleum demand is jet fuel. Oil is absolutely essential, not only for fueling commercial and private jets, but the aircraft used by our military forces to defend our freedoms. Again, there is no scalable substitute. Though electric cars will increase in popularity, it is essential to note that there are currently 265 million gasoline or diesel-powered vehicles on American roads, and just 2 million electric vehicles. And then 70% of electric cars are made from petroleum. Oil is also used to make asphalt, synthetic rubber, and many other products we take for granted. The wide-ranging and essential use of oil is one reason that even assuming widespread compliance with the Paris Climate Accords, the world is still expected to use 67 million barrels per day in 2040. The world is going to need a lot of oil for many years to come. That said, it is better to produce as much as possible here in the United States and continue to reduce our foreign imports. Find out more at IPRB.org.
Okay, here's a chart kind of with a breakdown of what that video covered. As you can see, gasoline is a big chunk, but then you also have diesel fuel essentially here, jet fuel 9%. Really what's going to make oil remain in high demand for the foreseeable future is hydrocarbon gas liquids, which is currently at 15%. But if you think of the things that they're used to make, including medical supplies, 70% of an electric vehicle, even renewable energy infrastructure, your smartphones, about any tech gadget you can think of has a lot of petrochemical components. So as Goldman Sachs says here, petrochemicals will become the new base load for oil demand, driven by economic growth and rising consumption, especially in emerging markets. And what they mean by emerging markets is Asia. Asia's standard of living is increasing dramatically. Their economy is growing dramatically. So a lot of the new demand, it's a big world. It's not just the United States. The rest of the world is starting to raise its standard of living and have more access to energy. So that's why just about any source of energy you can think of is going to increase over the next 30 years. Here's another example of kind of the petrochemical base of a smartphone. These things can't exist without it. So I've just got about 2 minutes, and I don't want to take up too much more of these guys' times because they're going to tell you the really important stuff. Today, we're going to cover exploration, drilling, production, transportation, and storage, all the way through refining to get these end products listed here at the bottom that we've already covered. So we're going to tell you where oil comes from and how we find it, how we get it out of the ground, and what we do with oil once we get it out of the ground, and why it's so important. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Ross Basnett. He is a petroleum geologist, and his charge is finding oil, which is a lot more difficult than a lot of folks realize, and also takes a lot of math, a lot of figuring, and a lot of science based knowledge to basically find the oil, find something that you cannot see that's underground. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Ross Basnett.
Thanks, Seth. Yeah, my name is Ross Basnett. I'm a petroleum geologist down here in Carmi, Illinois for Campbell Energy. We're a fairly large company for the Illinois Basin standards. We're a very small company as in when you compare us to an Exxon or a Shell or some global company like that. We produce around a little over 4,000 barrels a day, around 4,300, which is a lot, but it's, like I said, a very small drop into a very large bucket when you're compared to the rest of the country, rest of the world. My area of, I guess, expertise, if you will, is the geology side. Where to find oil, where to potentially look for new oil, where to find oil. Honestly, we're not reinventing the wheel. You know, a lot of places to find oil, the best place to find oil is in the oil field. You know, we've had a lot of success using techniques from other industries, from other basins that have spent a lot more money than we have, to kind of find those reservoirs, or those untapped reservoirs, or those barrels behind the pipe that are just deemed too tight or too expensive to get out. We've had very good success doing that. First off, I want to talk about really one of the myths and stuff like that of why, you know, how oil is formed. A lot of people think, you know, oil came from dinosaurs, right? And that's not necessarily the truth. It's actually formed, you know, the Illinois basin was a shallow sea millions of years ago. We're talking about like a modern day type Bahamas atmosphere. Shallow sea filled with lots of plankton, you know, like on, you know, SpongeBob's buddy. That's what the organisms that are, you know, that are creating the carbon content that are creating the oil reservoirs that we're having now. This slide shows pretty much what I was just talking about. If you go over to the far left, where we're just talking about an ocean, you see the shark up there. Those little cloudy dots that are floating around through there, where it says small marine organisms, that's what I'm talking about with the plankton. That's the area of, you know, that's the organisms, the carbon filled creatures that are going to be, you know, they're going to die one day. They're going to fall to the bottom of the ocean. They're going to be covered back up, and then the process continues. You know, heat and pressure, and lots of time, you know, they create that, and they force that, which once was living life, you know, carbon organism, now it's a hydrocarbon. It's trapped within the rock. That rock where they were originally laid down is the source rock. And again, over time, they continue to be buried and buried and buried as other sediment falls in on top of it. Over the time, that sediment, you know, which may be mud or sand or whatever, turns into a rock form. Each of these rocks, depending on where they're at and within where they were laid down, they could be shales, you know, muds turn into shales, sands turn into sandstones, offshore, a little deeper water turns into a limestone or dolomite. And then later on down through the process, you know, that oil migrates, and we'll get into this a little bit more. Oil migrates throughout until it finds a trap rock or a cap rock. That rock that it then forms in would be the reservoir, which is what that very far right slide is showing, with that where it says trapped gas, trapped oil. Well, the oil comes down. We learned in first grade chemistry, you know, that oil floats on top of water. This is a primary aspect of what a geologist does in the Illinois basin. You know, just like outside, I don't know what it looks like out y'all's window, but if I look outside mine, I can see a hill, I can see a valley, I can see a creek. To an extent, the same thing is happening beneath the surface. We have hills, we have valleys. Those rock beds, which you can see kind of through those striped pattern, each one of those indicated a separate rock bed or formation, and those are mappable. They're areas where, you know, with a trained eye and knowing what characteristics go with each rock, you know, geologists can find out where they're at. And it's important to know, like what I talked about with how oil floats on top of water, because I said, you know, those hills and valleys, those rocks have moved over time, and they have formed either a hill or a valley. And with the first grade, you know, chemistry, we talked about with oil floating on top of water, that oil migrates through that gap or through those rocks until it finds that cap rock. And if you can find where that cap rock is on top of the highest point in the would-be reservoir, that's going to be an ideal place for an oil deposit to be found. Go ahead, Seth. This is another myth that we kind of run into. A lot of people, think about when you hit an oil well, you're going to drill down, you're going to hit a giant cave or a giant cavern with a lake of oil. Take a straw, suck it out. Now you're left with a giant hole in the ground underneath, right? Well, that's not the case. We're looking at what we call porosity, and porosity is the individual space that's in between grains. If you think of it like a Coke, you can go into a gas station, you can pick up a Coke, and fill it full of ice, as much ice as you can fit in there, but you're still going to have enough room in between those pores or in between those each individual ice cubes for your Coke to fill. The same purpose is what's going on here. That's what happens. So.
Okay, Ross, this is the video that shows why we have oil in Illinois. It's been a while since we've done one of those, so I don't know if you remembered that, but that's what we're going to go ahead and play here. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play.
When most people picture Illinois, they see cities like Chicago or Peoria or East St. Louis, or they see large stretches of wonderful farmland. The state is pretty flat. Most of it was covered by enormous glaciers a few tens of thousands of years ago, and when they finally retreated, they left thick mantles of fertile soil, which is excellent for farming. There are very few indications on the surface that suggest there are important oil deposits underground in Illinois. So why is it that oil can be found in rock layers beneath the surface today? In fact, Illinois has produced about 3.5 billion barrels of oil so far, and is still producing about 9 million barrels a year. What makes these facts possible? You see, Illinois is part of what is called the Illinois Basin, a shallow bowl-shaped depression in the earth that has slowly filled with layer upon layer of rock over hundreds of millions of years. If you were to slice the state from, say, Chicago down to the southern tip at about Cairo, you would see that the rock layers that are exposed at the surface in Chicago are found about 5,000 feet deep or so near the town of Fairfield in south central Illinois, and then they get shallower again as you go toward the southern tip of the state. Geologists, who are scientists who examine the materials that make up the earth, have learned about these rock layers and have given them different names based on the appearance of each significant layer. By constructing what they call a stratigraphic column, they can create a kind of guide to tell them what rock layer they are viewing at a given point in Illinois. In this illustration, the yellow layers are sandstones, the blue layers are limestones, the purple layers are dolomites, the brown layers are shales, and the pink portion at the bottom of the column represents igneous rocks like granite. Oil and gas are normally found in porous spaces inside some of these rocks, which we then call reservoirs. One example of a reservoir rock is a sandstone. Here is a very thin section of a sandstone shown in microscopic view. The pore spaces between the grains are stained blue for clarity. Another example of a potential reservoir rock is a limestone. In some places in Illinois, dolomites form excellent reservoir rocks as well. Shales normally form what are called cap rocks, which seal in the oil and prevent it from leaking out of the reservoirs. Igneous rocks, such as granite, rarely make good reservoirs because they have very little porosity. Since oil floats on water, and since most porous rock contains some kind of fluid, we almost always look for places where oil has reached the highest spot it can reach in a reservoir rock. If a cap rock is sealing that reservoir rock, then we have the right condition for a hydrocarbon trap. There are several kinds of hydrocarbon traps in Illinois, In this example, we are showing a simple anticline trap, basically an underground hill. Anticlinal traps provide the mechanism for some of the most significant oil fields in the state. These anticlines form over millions of years when the rock layers are slowly bent by forces shaping the earth. Another trap type shown on this cross-section is one made by limestone reefs that formed in Illinois long before there were dinosaurs. Porosity in these reefs is caused by fossils, such as corals, or the dissolution of fossils, which will leave small cavities. If a reef is overlain by a tight cap rock, such as a shale, the oil is trapped inside the reef. Another type of trap we find in Illinois forms when faults shift the rock layers. If a reservoir rock gets moved so that it is completely surrounded by tight rock, then we can have a hydrocarbon trap. Although in this example, it looks pretty simple, some of these kinds of traps can be quite complex. Some traps are formed when a porous layer of rock pinches out against a tight layer. In this example, a porous sandstone pinches out against a tight shale. The oil has moved to the highest point in the reservoir rock where it cannot escape. A slightly more complicated trap can occur when an ancient river valley contains isolated sandstone bars in it, just like the sandbars you see today in the rivers around Illinois. Sometimes these valleys are filled with shale. When they cut through a reservoir rock, oil can be trapped there as well. Although 3.5 billion barrels of oil has already been produced in Illinois, there are many more traps waiting to be found. Searching for these traps will be one of the challenges for the next generation of geologists and engineers.
That pretty much explains everything that I was talking about, and probably explains a little bit better than what I could. The slide up now, it kind of reiterates that last part of where we find oil and how it's kind of trapped in there. Most of the stuff that I use, or the traps and the reservoirs that I'm using for, are conventional style, and which will be that top left there with an anticline. We said, when we're looking through these rocks and these reservoirs, that they're usually filled with three components: oil, gas, and water. Gas is going to be the lightest; it's going to sit at the very top. Oil is next; it's going to sit beneath the gas, and then water is beneath it. So, like I said, if we can find that spot where at the highest point, where we can get into the top part of that, which would be the oil, we'll have good success, or the best success that we could have for that, to be able to be a profitable oil reservoir. The other one would probably be like those valley traps and the pinch outs, which would be more of like the one on the bottom right. Kind of where you could have a sand run through there, and then it pinches out on both sides and doesn't have anywhere to go. That's another episode, or another portion of the trap that we use quite a bit. There are several fault traps around the Illinois basin. I don't want to say they're not around, but they're significant plays in the basin. They've been formed by fault traps, which are a vital aspect of the geology. It can be very complex, like that video is saying. But probably the two main ones, at least that I use personally, will be the two that I discussed.
All right, Ross, you want to go ahead and hand it over to Mike?
Yeah, you can go ahead and hand over Mike, and if you have anything else or any other questions at the end, I'll be happy to answer anything I can.
Okay. Yeah, Ross was telling you basically how geologists go about finding oil and the science involved in that. Mike's specialty in his profession is getting oil out of the ground. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Mike Payne. He's got more than 40 years of experience in the industry, with worn a lot of different hats, but primarily what he'll talk today about is petroleum engineering, and basically the exploration process. The conclusion of that is drilling and production. and sort of the skills involved in that, which involves a lot of math. So go ahead and hand it over to Mike.
Thanks, Seth, and thank you all for having us once again. And the main thing that I'm going to be discussing today is, how do we get oil out of the ground, and how can we, optimize it? Drilling a well costs a lot of money. The wells that Ross and I are involved in can take anywhere from $500,000 to $750,000 worth of money to invest in, and risk in getting a dry hole and seeing part of that money disappear. But once the oil is found, it's the engineer's responsibility to get that oil out of the ground and into the stock tanks and to the refinery, so it can be converted into the materials and gasoline that we use daily. We have a video, and I'm going to go ahead and let Seth play that, and that'll describe a lot of the initial functions or initial phases of drilling for oil, and then we will continue on from there.
Once all of the hard work to generate a prospect is completed, and if the land on which the prospect sits can be leased, the drill site is selected and a drilling rig is moved onto location. Drilling rigs come in many sizes depending on the depths being drilled. In Illinois, most wells are relatively shallow by industry standards, normally reaching depths of between 2,000 and 4,000 feet. Typical wells in Illinois now cost between $50,000 and $200,000 to drill and complete, depending whether it's a dry hole or a producer. There is much equipment on location, including the derrick itself, diesel engines for power, a shed to house the drilling crew, tubs to hold the drilling pipe, and reservoirs, usually pits dug into the ground that hold the drilling mud. This mud is used while drilling to cool the bit and continuously flush the rock debris out of the hole. It is pumped out of the reservoir through a hose, up through the swivel, then down the drill pipe where it is shot out of the end of the bit. On most modern oil rigs, a tricone bit is used to drill through the rock layers. The weight of the drill pipe on the bit is regulated by the driller, and as the bit rotates, it tears through the rock, breaking it into small chips that are flushed up out of the hole by the drilling mud that is being pumped down the pipe. For clarity's sake, we shall not show the drilling mud from this point on. The rig normally keeps drilling 24 hours a day in all types of weather. In Illinois, it usually takes about 5 days of constant drilling to reach depths of around 3,000 feet. As the drilling continues, the borehole gets closer to the target zone where the geologist hopes to find oil. Since most porous rock layers contain water, and since oil and gas float on water, the target is usually the highest point in a porous rock layer that happens to be sealed by an overlying tight layer of rock. This tight or impermeable rock layer is what keeps the oil and gas from leaking out. In our illustration, we have colored the reservoir to represent the type of fluid it is holding. If natural gas is present, it occupies the highest part of the reservoir since it is the lightest. Under the natural gas is oil, and under the oil is water. In our illustration here, you will notice that the borehole missed another layer of rock that contains oil. Unless someone realizes that fact, that oil trap may never be discovered. An oil reservoir is not a pool or lake of oil as some people imagine. If we look closely, we see that it is actually a rock with pore spaces in it. The more pore spaces, the better the reservoir. These pore spaces can be between grains of sand in a sandstone or in small, even microscopic cavities formed in limestone or dolomite. If the pore spaces are connected, then it is relatively easy to get the oil and gas out, and the well can produce large volumes of fluid. The oil and gas in a reservoir can be under great pressure. This pressure is caused by factors including the amount of natural gas dissolved in the oil or by water pushing on the oil. When the borehole finally reaches the reservoir, the pressure is released and oil and gas can leave the rock. If it were not for the weight of all that drilling mud in the hole, the oil and gas would rush up the hole and cause a gusher, which may look nice for the movies, but creates quite a mess and costs quite a bit of money to clean up. Once the target is reached, and if indicators suggest that a commercial oil well might result, pipe is run down the hole and cement is pumped into the pipe and forced up the outside to secure it in place. This pipe helps to prevent any oil and gas from polluting shallower rock layers that might contain drinking water. Holes are then shot through the pipe and into the rock layer that contains the oil. Smaller pipe, called tubing, is then run into the hole, and if the well cannot flow on its own, a pump is inserted into the hole to help pull the oil up. At the surface, a pump jack has been installed to operate the pump downhole. Pump jacks are powered either by a natural gas engine or more commonly by an electric motor. As the rods connected to the downhole pump move up and down, oil is forced up the tubing and is pushed through pipe that has now been laid and buried underground, called the flow line, and heads toward the storage tanks. These storage tanks are arranged in a group and collectively called a tank battery. Around these tanks is a dirt wall that helps prevent any spilled oil from leaking onto the land. When the oil reaches the tank battery, it first goes into the separator. Here, oil floats to the top and flows out into the oil storage tanks. Trucks come whenever needed to haul the oil off to the refinery. Water flows out of the separator to the water tank. This water is later injected back into the oil reservoirs, where it helps to maintain some of the pressure and to drive oil towards the producing wells.
Okay, so you can see that there was a lot of information right there, and it was very basic information, but it gave you a good illustration of the process of drilling a well and getting the oil to stock tanks. One of the things that I want to encourage you to do over the next few minutes, and I know Ross mentioned this, but write down some questions, because we're going to have a little bit of time here at the end for questions, and we want to make sure that we get those answered for everyone. One of the things that was not shown that's very important is all of the information that we need in the course of drilling a well. And I'm going to kind of display some of those things here now for the group. But, one of the things that we do is we collect samples, and this is one thing that Ross spends time looking at. I don't know whether you can tell, it's kind of, my light is not where it can, but there's actually a little bit of oil stain on these samples. These are from a well that was drilled to about 4,200 feet. And so there's a little oil stain there, and that's one thing that we look for. And they'll look at these under a corvoscope microscope and actually see, that's our first indication that there is oil in this well. One of the things that is involved in the job of the engineer is to determine how much oil is in the ground. So we use a lot of volumetrics, which involves math. We use software to help us calculate that. Some of it's done by hand, but we also use different shapes. And so being able to calculate, not only rectangles and squares, but cones and even oddly shaped reservoir patterns is very important. And so that's one thing that math and science really comes into play whenever we talk about, calculating the amount of oil that is in the ground. Like the video said, it's not a pool. It's contained within the rock. And the other thing that wasn't mentioned during the video, but is very important, is the acquisition of data. And so you see a lot of squiggly lines on this downhole, open hole electric log. And the lines, each one of those lines represents a number. And the logging company will give us a file, not only this paper copy of the representation of the lines, but also a digital copy of the lines in number format. And we will take those those numbers and do the calculations to determine how thick the reservoir is, what the net reservoir, there's a term called gross reservoir, which is the overall thickness of the rock stratigraphy that we're drilling through, and then the net, which is going to be the producible oil volume. Again, math, very important. Knowledge of, being able to calculate those kinds of numbers. We've got acres, we've got feet, we've got porosity decimals, we've got oil saturation decimals, we've got stock tank barrels. There's a calculation that figures the formation volume factor, which is the volume of gas versus the volume of hydrocarbons. And so you can see that, the role of the engineer as well as the role of the geologist is very vital in not only finding oil, but getting it produced to the surface. So once we, determine that we have a well that we can produce economically, again, we're spending a lot of money. We've got to recoup that money. $500,000. The video mentioned 250 to 300,000. Those are for those 3,000 foot wells. The deeper wells cost more. The more you drill, the more it costs. So those things are calculated in there. You've got to get a payback, and you want to make money off of your venture that you've invested in. So computing the volume of oil that it's going to produce a day, again, is based on those reservoir factors, which may also include bottom hole pressure, the pressure that that fluid comes into the pipe and gets produced by the pump that you saw. And then also how fast that the permeability allows that oil to flow to that wellbore. And then naturally, as we've already mentioned, the volume of oil that is there. So you can see it's kind of an involved process. And again, I'm speaking of it in a very general fashion, but it is quite involved. And it's very important to, have that math and science background to be able to perform these kinds of calculations and operations. And each reservoir and pumping unit, as you saw the pumping unit, and you can see kind of over my shoulder is kind of a model of one. Each of those has to be sized for the well. So again, you've got calculations which involve ratios and involves sizes and strokes per minute that pumping unit is going to go up and down, and how big the bottom hole pump is, whether it's a inch and a half, inch and 3/4, 2 inch, 2 1/4, maybe even a little bit larger if necessary. Or at times we may have what is called a submersible pump, which is a pump that actually goes down to the bottom of the well. The motor, everything is at the bottom of the well, and it actually pushes the oil up the tubing and to the tanks. So again, all of this has to be sized. You can put in your standard size tanks, but sometimes you need bigger tanks. The standard size tank is 210 barrels, which sometimes may only be enough for about 3 or 4 hours worth of production. Other times it may be enough for several days of production, or even months perhaps. So you can put in smaller tanks. They cost a little bit less. Of course, the larger tanks cost quite a bit more. So it's all about sizing and all about optimization. And sometimes we get into involved statistics. And I know that's probably a little bit over where you're at right now, but thinking ahead, statistics and quantitative analysis, those kinds of things are also important. I don't want to scare you and make you think that it's so difficult that, you can't do it with all of the, big numbers and big talk and all of that. But it is very challenging and very exciting to be able to do those kinds of things and determine what, an oil well will make. We do projections on the amount of oil that the well will make. So anyway, I know we've got a little bit of time left here. Again, get your questions ready and we'll answer those toward the end. So thank you again very much.
All right, thanks, Mike. And I think Suffice it to say, basic math skills are absolutely essential to work in the oil industry. I think these guys use more math than they even realize. So I want to cover a little bit about Illinois specifically before we hand it over for questions. It looks like we got about 8 minutes, so I'll go through these pretty quick. A lot of folks aren't even aware there's a oil industry in Illinois, but we are one of the few states that has a pretty robust industry, including upstream, midstream, and downstream, which are the three major sectors. So we produce about 8 to 9 million barrels per year. That's mostly in the southern part of the state where Mike, Ross, and I are located. Quite a bit south of you guys. You guys are up in the Champaign area, so that's really the northern edge of the basin. I think there's some production there in Mattoon in the Coles County area, and that's about as far north as it goes. But we do have production, the production side, which is what we cover. We also have the second largest oil storage facility in the United States, and that basically serves as a hub for our refineries, which we have 4 refineries and a 5th one that's just across the border in Indiana. So we have the largest oil refining capacity in the Midwest. So we are basically the hub for the Midwest when it comes to supplying petroleum products. Here's just kind of a map of where the industry is located in Illinois. As you can see, the pump jacks represent the production. We've got the 4 refineries, as you can see here, and the Patoka terminal, which is centrally located. So you add it all up, and there's more than 16,000 direct oil industry jobs. This is all the jobs, not just the production side. If you take production only, we have about 4,000 direct jobs, 16,000 overall though. So a lot of folks are near retirement age. About 1/4 of our workforce is near retirement age. As we mentioned earlier, we're going to need oil for a long time. It's already 3% of our state's economy. So the oil industry pays well because the jobs are in demand. Takes smart people, takes a lot of people because of the folks retiring. So there's going to be a pretty strong demand looking in the next 20, 30 years, more than a lot of folks realize. And real quickly, again, your teacher mentioned to me, you guys talked about royalty payments. This graphic here to the bottom left notes there's 30,000 people in Illinois who receive royalty income from oil production. And what royalty is if you own minerals, you get, I think the rate is it's somewhere between 12 and 15% of the revenue from an oil well goes to the royalty owners. So basically what that means is if an oil company drills a well, that revenue not all of it goes to that company. The royalty is the mineral owners slice of that income from oil production. So, and that can be severed between many people. And also an oil company sometimes will, or a lot of times actually, will get multiple investors in a drilling project. So a lot of folks in Illinois receive income from the oil production in the state. This is kind of a United States overview. About 10 million people can attribute their jobs to the industry. That's a huge number. So it's either directly or indirectly. The oil industry has what they call a multiplier, to where I think that the rate is about 5 for every direct oil industry job. Those jobs support another 4 to 5 jobs. So that adds up to 10 million folks in the United States. We are the top oil and natural gas producer in the world, and that's a recent development. There's been new technologies implemented that have raised our status from rapidly declining production to actually the largest producer in the world. So with that, I think we've got about 4 minutes. I'm going to hand it over to questions for you guys. I want to thank you again for having us. We really enjoyed sharing this information with you, and hopefully it wasn't too much. And we just want to let you guys ask us any questions you might have now.
Thank you. Okay, any questions about what was covered. I realized there was a lot there, but I know we had some questions before the presentation. Do you have any questions now?
Yeah, how
You've
long
heard
does it take to drill pipe?
Say that again.
I said, how long does it take to drill pipe down to the oil?
The question is, how long does it take to start the drilling and get the pipe to the oil? I realize that's kind of an open-ended question, but about what might that be in Illinois?
Generally, the wells that I'm on and the wells that Mike are on are around 4,000 feet, give or take 100 feet. During the time it takes, roughly by the time we move in, move out, we're on and off in about 7 days. So as long as everything goes well, there's a lot of things that can go, that maybe throw a wrench in it and delays, but most of the time I'd say on and off in a week.
That's 24 hours a day, almost all the time, right?
24 hours a day for about 7 days, and then we're off. And then we can start the completion process, which, is another, it takes, or Mike can get more into that. There are several aspects of that come in, but I mean, hopefully within a month, you can have everything up and going. Some wells sooner than that, but I'd say roughly about a month if by the time you start the drilling process to, if you find oil, setting pipe and getting it completed and putting it online, roughly in that time frame.
Thank you. That reminded me of something I wanted to ask about that I was there for at the seminar 3 years ago. As you're bringing things up through the pipe, I was wondering if you could tell the people here what happens in terms of when the samples come up and there's a geologist on site. I was just wondering if you could describe to them a little bit of what happens in terms of evaluating those samples that are brought up.
Well, as we're drilling, we're catching samples every 5 feet. And we get down to a depth and where we think we're going to have oil. So we're catching samples every 5 feet. They're put in those little bags that Mike showed. The first thing I do with them, the first thing they do with them too, is smell it and see if there's any kind of gas might be present or any kind of hydrocarbon, odor that comes with it. And then I take it straight from there, clean those samples up, and look at them underneath the microscope. See what kind of rock it is, if it's oil or if it's sand, lime, shale, whatever it may be. And then obviously the biggest question of that is, does it contain oil? And
Okay.
About how much?
Very good. I appreciate the answer. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Our bell has rung, but I appreciate the presentation and all the information that was provided. And I'll follow up with you on if I have access to the recording of it. That would be great.
Yeah, we should be able to get that to you today. It'll be a large file, but I'll send it through Gmail. Sometimes it won't go through my Yahoo because it's so huge, but
Oh yeah, I know that those files are really big.
Have a good day.
Thank you. We
thank
appreciate
you for
it.
having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry to cut you off so abruptly, but that's the nature of.
Oh, I understand. I
of
understand.
what we have. I appreciate everything that you offered us.
Thank you again.
Thank you.